Hello, I'm Mr. Eliason, and welcome to World History. Today we're going to look at the aftermath of World War II and set the stage for talking about the beginning of the Cold War in both Europe and Asia. So, let's talk about the end of this devastating conflict and what safeguards were put in place afterwards to both help the world recover and to prevent something like this from happening again. So, as you will hopefully remember from our lessons before, World War II was an utterly devastating conflict with the Eastern Front, the Pacific Theater, what was happening in China, things like that, killing huge numbers of people, far in excess of what any previous war had caused. We also see spectacular devastation as far as cities go. We saw the absolute destruction of German cities, the destruction of Japanese cities, and a significant need to rebuild a lot of these areas. Germany was dealt with very differently after World War II than after World War I. The decision was made at the Yalta Conference, which we'll talk more about next time, to partition Germany up into four different zones controlled by each of the Allied countries, with the capital city of Berlin also partitioned into four separate zones. This was to ensure that Germany would be able to be rebuilt to some extent, as well as to really assure that there would be no German aggression in the future. With the basic lesson being, you start two world wars, you don't get to be a country anymore. And so until Germany learns its lesson, it's not going to be reunited. And so Germany is going to face a solid 50 years of being separated into different zones of occupation. We are also going to start putting German leaders on trial. So, unlike World War I, we're going to put a lot of leaders on trial. The Nuremberg trials were the trial of German and Nazi officials for war crimes and for their actions against the Jewish people. For a lot of these Nazi criminals, their defense was pretty straightforward. Hitler had a totalitarian regime. They were just following the orders that they were given. But the Nuremberg trials are going to establish the principle that just following orders is not an acceptable defense, and some orders are not okay. For example, if someone orders you to do the Holocaust, probably don't do that because later the defense, well, someone else told me to do the Holocaust, is not going to hold up in your inevitable war crimes trial. And so several hundred Nazi leaders are put on trial. Some of them are executed, some of them are jailed for life, and some of them are given lengthy prison terms. And so this is how we're going to deal with the issue of war crimes after the war in Europe. In Asia, Japan is going to be occupied by the United States. The United States is going to be responsible for the most part for rebuilding Japan. We are going to set up a variety of different military facilities in Japan in order to occupy and assist with the rebuilding. And the United States is going to take sole responsibility for the military defense of Japan going forward. Japan's offensive military forces are going to be strictly limited, and the United States is going to guarantee the safety and security of Japan for the foreseeable future. Some of that is changing today because of the rising threat of China, but in general, the United States still provides for the military security of Japan and some other Asian countries. Japanese leaders are also going to be put on trial for war crimes, and significantly more of them are going to be executed. We are going to make the monumental decision to not charge the emperor as a war criminal. It was seen that was seen as too divisive and too problematic. And so the emperor, Hirohito, is not going to be put on trial, but many of the other top Japanese leaders will be put on trial for war crimes and atrocities, and a number of them will be executed. The emperor is going to stay on the throne, but his power is going to be strictly limited. He's going to become a figurehead similar to kings and queens in Europe. And so there is still a royal family in Japan, but they have no real power in governing, similarly to how the royal family in England has no power and authority in governing. Their role is mostly ceremonial and cultural. And in Japan, that means Shinto ceremonies, things like that. Japanese are going to have a new democratic constitution that is mostly sort of ghost written by the United States. They're going to create a parliamentary democracy with a legislature with universal suffrage, an executive branch in which a prime minister is chosen and a cabinet is formed, and an independent judiciary which then reviews laws, things like that. It's all of Montesquieu's greatest hits here. You've got a European Enlightenment-style government in Japan with a series of divided powers and checks and balances, and it's functioned pretty well up until today. And so the Constitution of Japan is going to set the stage for democratic, sort of liberal government in Japan. And Japan is pretty quickly going to become one of the US's strongest allies. We'll talk about this a little more when we talk about the Cold War in Asia, but the growing threat of the Soviet Union and China, to some extent, allows the US and Japan to mend bridges and become relatively close allies. And sort of the geopolitical realities in Asia is going to lead to the US occupation of Japan ending before the 10-year time frame that was sort of laid out in the original occupation plan. And then Japan is going to kind of chart their own path, and we'll spend more time talking about that in future lessons. Japan itself, economically, is going to be rebuilt, and that means a lot of cleanup from the atomic bomb. One of the things that we were not totally aware of when the atomic bomb was being used is the long-term effects of the radiation of the bomb. And so this is going to be a major problem, is cleaning up the radioactive material that was in the atomic bomb sites, and then dealing with the medical treatment of the people who get leukemia and other diseases from exposure to radiation. And so that's going to be a huge piece, as is rebuilding the Japanese economy. The Japanese are going to restructure their economy and rebuild their economy on a model similar to the United States. And significant portions of Japanese cities have to be rebuilt because, of course, of the extensive destruction from World War II. The Japan that emerges after World War II is going to be a very modern society, and their economy is really going to take off in the 1960s and 1970s as they fully embrace capitalism, and especially the development of sort of high-tech exports and products like that. And so we'll check back in on Japan as we move forward, but Japan is going to embark on this massive rebuilding project. One of the other takeaways from one of our wartime conferences is the creation of the United Nations. The United Nations is a global peacekeeping organization sort of similar to the League of Nations after World War I, but with some pretty significant differences. For example, everyone is going to join the League of Nations and be a member of the General Assembly, so you're not going to have massive holdouts like the United States creating these huge gaps in membership. We're also going to have this sort of overarching body, the Security Council, with 15 members, but with 5 permanent members, namely China, France, Russia, the United States, and Great Britain. At this point, of course, Russia is the Soviet Union, and there's some question as to which China is going to be on the Security Council, because the Chinese Civil War is going to pick up right after World War II, which we'll talk about 2 lessons from now. But the Security Council has unanimous veto power, and so for critics of the United Nations, this really prevents it from dealing with issues amongst the great powers, because throughout the whole Cold War, and to some extent today, the interests of the United States and Russia/the Soviet Union are not aligned. And even today, the United States and China have some pretty significant issues that the UN can't deal with because of the unanimous veto power of all of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council. These countries were chosen because of their state status as the main allied powers in World War II. And as you can notice, there are some gaps in the Security Council. For example, no African countries or South American countries are permanent members of the Security Council. And so the UN reflects the sort of status and the prestige of countries in the post-World War II world, and it really hasn't changed since then. The challenge, of course, is the increasing pressure between the United States and the Soviet Union. Both sides are trying to rebuild the areas that they've occupied under the terms of the agreement at Yalta. The Soviet Union is, of course, trying to spread the influence of communism, while the United States is trying to rebuild Western Europe in the capitalist mode that they had been previously. This is obviously a monumental task, as most of Europe and a significant amount of Asia is in ruins. And so, for the communists, they're going to try to send in and push the merits of communism. The United States is going to try to push the merits of capitalism. And the competition between these 2 powers is really going to set the stage for our whole next unit, the Cold War. The United States is going to put significant money into the areas that they control, this Marshall Plan that we're going to talk about next time, whereas the Soviet Union is going to solidify control over what is called the Eastern Bloc. these areas over here that constitute both the Soviet republics that are part of the USSR itself and also the areas that are liberated by the Red Army. And so the economic path of these two regions are going to diverge for reasons that we're going to talk about next time. And we'll go into more depth on the whole Iron Curtain thing and the battle between Truman and Stalin for control over these areas in Europe. For the United States, rebuilding Western Europe and rebuilding Asia was incredibly important because everyone saw the global sort of divide between the United States and the Soviet Union and the battle between communism and capitalism for the fate of the world in the post-World War II era. And so the quicker both sides could build up their allies and spread their influence, the more resources they would have to fight this new global Cold War that is emerging in the aftermath of the defeat of Germany and Japan. The other challenge is what to deal with refugees, both Jewish refugees from the Holocaust and other refugees from the various areas, specifically Eastern Europe. The United States and other countries don't do a particularly good job here. The US does raise their quota. As you hopefully remember, the United States still had a race-based or racially based or ethnicity-based quota system in order to limit immigration in the aftermath of World War I. We do not scrap that, despite the vast needs of Eastern Europeans during this time period. And so to some extent, we close the doors to refugees from World War I. A lot of Jewish people are forced to stay in the very same concentration camps where they were almost exterminated, oftentimes for almost a year. And it really creates a crisis where we don't allow anti-communist refugees from the Eastern Bloc to move to the United States. And so, to some extent, pragmatism and previous sort of xenophobic tendencies lead to continued suffering from the refugees of World War II. And so that'll end it for today. We're going to get more in depth into the Cold War next time as we look first at Europe and then Asia, and then we end our World War II unit. So for now, we'll leave you here. Thank you for listening.